The wolves began howling before she reached the gate. Ilara Voss heard them first as a distant sound, something she might have mistaken for wind moving through the ancient pines that bordered the Duskmoor packlands on all sides, a low and resonant vibration that she felt more in her chest than she heard with her ears. She had been traveling for 3 days, and exhaustion had a way of making the world soft at its edges, turning ordinary sounds into something almost musical. She told herself that was what she was hearing. Wind, trees. The ordinary music of a wild place that did not belong to human roads or human schedules. She adjusted the leather satchel on her shoulder, the one that contained the treaty documents her father had spent 18 months negotiating, and she kept walking. The gravel path to the main gates was narrow and pale in the early morning light, and on either side the forest breathed with a density that made it feel alive in ways that had nothing to do with birds or insects. The trees here were older than anything she had seen in the human territories, their roots breaking through the path in great dark knuckles of ancient wood. Their canopy so thick, it turned the path into a tunnel even in late autumn. She was not afraid. She had told herself she was not afraid so many times that the words had become a rhythm. Left foot, right foot, I am not afraid. Left foot, right foot, the howling is just wind. It was not wind. By the time she reached the final curve in the path before the gates came into view, the howling had grown into something enormous and coordinated, a sound that filled the forest from ground to canopy and seemed to press against her from all directions at once. She stopped walking. Her feet stopped before her mind gave the instruction, and she stood on the pale gravel path with the morning light filtering green and gold through the remaining leaves above her, and she listened to what the wolves of Duskmoor were doing. They were not howling in alarm. She knew enough about wolf behavior, had studied enough in preparation for this assignment, to recognize the difference between a warning howl and something else entirely. The alarm howl was sharp and staccato, a sound designed to carry information across distance. This was not that. This was long and sustained and almost ceremonial, the kind of howl that, according to everything she had read, was reserved for specific occasions. The return of a lost pack member, the recognition of a new alpha, the acknowledgement of something sacred passing through the territory. She stood and listened, and felt the sound move through her bones in a way that should have frightened her, and instead felt, bewilderingly, like being recognized. She had never been recognized before. Not truly. Not in the way that mattered. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Ilara Voss was 24 years old and had spent most of those years being efficiently invisible. She was the third daughter of Harlan Voss, a diplomat of middling rank who served the Human Council of Kingdoms with competence and no particular distinction. Her 2 older sisters were beautiful and socially gifted in the ways that mattered in human court life, and her younger brother was brilliant in a mathematical way that made older men with power lean forward when he spoke. Ilara was none of these things, or at least, that was what she had come to believe, which was perhaps not the same as it being true. She was a good messenger. She had a talent for memorizing routes and retaining the exact wording of verbal communications, even after days of travel, and she had a quality her father described, not unkindly, as unremarkableness, which meant she could move through spaces without drawing attention to herself. The treaty documents in her satchel were too important to entrust to a lower-ranked courier, and too sensitive to send with anyone whose face the Duskmoor court might already have opinions about. Ilara was perfect for the task, because no one had opinions about her. She arrived. She delivered. She left. She did not linger in memory. This was her value, and she had made something that looked enough like peace with it to get her through the mornings. The wolves of Duskmoor apparently had not received the information about her unremarkableness. She forced herself to begin walking again. The gates came into view around the curve, and she stopped for a second time, not from fear, but from simple, open-mouthed surprise. She had expected guards. What she had not expected was the sight of approximately 30 wolves, some in their animal form, and some in their human form, all of them oriented toward the gate. all of them completely still, except for the sustained howling that was coming from the one still in wolf form. The human form wolves were not howling with their voices, but their posture was doing something equivalent, a kind of rigid attentiveness that she recognized from the behavior of very well-trained dogs when their owner came home, multiplied by 30, and made enormous and ancient and strange. 2 guards in human form stood at the gate itself, and they were staring at her with expressions she could not immediately categorize. Not hostile, not welcoming, something closer to stunned. "Elara Voss," she said, because naming herself felt like the right thing to do, like the first brick in a wall that might protect her from whatever this was. "I carry diplomatic correspondence from the Human Council of Kingdoms. I have an appointment with Alpha King Kalen Duskmore." The guard on the left, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw like a shelf and eyes the color of good amber, looked at his partner. His partner looked back at him. Something passed between them in that look that she could not read. Then the first guard returned his gaze to her and said, in a voice carefully stripped of emotion, "We know who you are, Miss Voss. Please come through. The king has been informed of your arrival." She walked through the gate, and the howling intensified for exactly 3 seconds, and then, between one breath and the next, went completely silent. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the howling had been. Kalen Duskmore heard the howl from his study on the 3rd floor, and he set down the document he was reading with a slowness that was the physical expression of iron self-control, because what he wanted to do was cross the room in 2 strides and put his fist through the window. Not from anger, from something he did not have a name for yet, which was more dangerous than anger because unnamed things could not be managed. He had been managing things for 11 years. He had been Alpha King of the Duskmore Pack since the death of his father in the border conflict with the Ashvale Pack, and in those 11 years he had made the management of himself and everything around him into something close to an art form. He was so good at it that members of his own council sometimes forgot he was also an alpha in the biological and spiritual sense, which meant there were impulses in him that management was merely a lid placed over, not an elimination of. The howling was from every wolf in the outer perimeter. He knew their voices the way he knew his own heartbeat, and not one of those voices was raised in alarm or aggression. What they were doing was something he had read about in the pack histories, described in the oldest texts as a recognition howl, a response the pack's collective instinct produced upon encountering a soul of their bloodline. He had never heard it in his lifetime. No one currently alive had, because the last time it occurred was 3 generations ago, and the memory of it existed only in records and in stories that elder wolves told at solstice fires. The diplomatic messenger from the Human Council was not supposed to be a bloodline soul. She was not supposed to be anything except an inconvenience, a political obligation he would fulfill with minimum investment, before returning to the actual work of governing a territory, navigating 3 simultaneous external pressures and 1 internal one. The internal pressure had a name, and the name was Seraphine Vale, and she was waiting for him in the council room below with her elegant patience, and her perfectly prepared arguments, and her absolute certainty that she was the correct choice for Alpha Queen, a certainty the council shared and that Kalen did not, which was becoming a structural problem he needed to address, and had been finding reasons not to address for approximately 8 months. He did not go to the window. He remained standing at his desk with his hands flat on the surface of it, and he listened to the howling reach its peak, and then, between one breath and the next, fall completely silent. The silence told him she had passed through the gate. He straightened his jacket, which was already straight, and left his study to go and be unreasonably, inexplicably disturbed by a diplomat's messenger who was, according to every piece of information he had been given, entirely ordinary. Elara was shown to a receiving room on the ground floor of the main hall, a room that was beautiful in the specific way that pack architecture was beautiful, which was to say it was large and built with materials that looked as though they had grown into their positions rather than been placed there. Great beams of dark wood arching overhead, stone walls that retained the warmth of the previous day's fires well into the morning, windows that framed the surrounding forest rather than looking away from it, She sat in the chair she was directed to, and resisted the urge to fidget with the satchel strap across her lap. The guard who had shown her in had left her alone, which meant she had approximately 2 minutes to compose herself before whatever came next, and she intended to use those 2 minutes efficiently. She was here to deliver documents. She was here to answer questions about the treaty terms on behalf of her father, who had been unable to make the journey due to illness, and to facilitate the beginning of a formal diplomatic relationship between the Human Council and the Duskmore Pack. She was not here to think about wolves howling as though her arrival was a sacred event. She was not here to think about the way that howling had felt in her bones, like the vibration of a tuning fork, finding its matched frequency. She was here for the documents. She smoothed the front of her travel coat, which was a practical dark blue, and somewhat worse for 3 days of road travel. And she sat up straight, and she waited. The door opened, and Kaelin Duskmore came into the room. She had seen portraits of him. The human courts circulated portraits of significant alpha rulers the way they circulated information about weather patterns because both were forces that affected trade and safety. She had studied his portrait with the same practicality with which she had studied the treaty terms, and the pack hierarchy, and the basic protocol of addressing an alpha king. The portrait had shown her a man in his early 30s, broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked as though it had been assembled from pieces selected for functionality rather than beauty, and had accidentally produced both. Dark hair, eyes the precise color of a winter sky at the moment, before a storm. A jaw that suggested someone had once tried to break it and failed. The portrait had not conveyed the weight of him. It was not a physical thing, or not only a physical thing. Kaelin Duskmore filled a room the way that a fire filled a room, not by occupying its space, but by changing the quality of everything in it. The temperature of the air shifted. The light seemed to lean toward him. The back of her neck prickled, and she had the sudden, irrational conviction that she was being looked at by something much older and more consequential than a man in his early 30s who governed a pack of supernatural beings in a forest territory on the edge of the human kingdoms. She stood because that was the protocol. And she met his eyes, because looking away first was the submissive gesture, and she was here as a representative of the Human Council. And she did not submit. And the moment their eyes met, something happened in her chest that she had no category for. Something that felt like the moment just before a very loud sound. The held breath instant of total potential. He stopped walking when their eyes met. She would remember that later. She would return to that detail repeatedly in the nights that followed. The way his forward motion simply ceased for approximately 2 seconds before he recovered it, and came the rest of the way into the room and stopped at a business-like distance and said, in a voice that was exactly as controlled as his face, "Miss Voss, I am Alpha King Kaelin Duskmore. You carry correspondence from the Human Council." "I do," she said, and her voice came out clear and steady, and she was grateful for that. She reached into the satchel and produced the sealed treaty document, her father's formal letter of introduction, and the secondary documentation outlining the proposed terms in greater detail. She held them out. "My father, Diplomat Harlan Voss, sends his respects and his apologies for his absence. He asked me to convey that these terms represent 18 months of careful negotiation, and that he hopes they will serve as the foundation for a relationship of mutual benefit between the human territories and the Duskmore Pack." Kaelin took the documents from her hand without touching her fingers, which she suspected was deliberate, and without looking away from her face for longer than the second required to confirm what he was holding. He handed the documents to someone she had not noticed, standing near the door, an aide or attendant of some kind, and then returned his full attention to her. "You will stay," he said. It was not a question. The terms require discussion. The council will need 3 days at minimum to review the secondary documentation. Chambers will be prepared for you. "I was not informed that my stay would extend beyond the initial delivery," she said carefully. "You are informed now," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite rudeness, and was not quite warmth, and was, she decided, simply the natural register of someone who had spent 11 years having his statements treated as the final word on any subject. You will be made comfortable. The pack will extend to you the courtesies of a guest under diplomatic protection. He paused, and something moved through his expression so quickly she almost did not catch it. A flicker of something that looked, impossibly, like uncertainty. I must ask you something, Miss Voss, and I require an honest answer. Of course. Have you been to these lands before? She blinked. No. This is my first time outside the human territories. Do you have any family connection to the Duskmore pack? Any ancestry that you are aware of? The question was strange enough that she forgot, for a moment, to be composed. I am human. My family has been human for as many generations as we can trace. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sensation again of being examined by something ancient, something that was using his eyes as a window, but lived much further back than any window could show. Yes, he said finally, and it sounded less like agreement and more like the conclusion of an internal argument he had been having with himself. Of course. I apologize for the unusual questions. You must be tired from your journey. My attendant will show you to your chambers. He turned and left the room without another word, and she stood there with her empty hands and the entirely unwelcome awareness that the 3 days of her enforced stay had just become the most interesting and alarming of her foreseeable future. The chambers they gave her overlooked what she would later learn was called the Pack Garden, a deliberately preserved piece of forest brought inside the hall's walls, with trees old enough to have opinions and a path of smooth stones that wound between them, as though no human hand had planned the route. She pushed open the window and smelled pine and earth and something sweeter underneath, something like the moment before rain, and she was trying to think practically about her situation when she noticed the woman in the doorway. She had not heard the door open. The woman was extraordinary looking, tall and narrow, built like a blade, with white blonde hair arranged in something simultaneously elegant and architectural, and a face of such precise symmetry it looked less like a face and more like an argument for geometric perfection. Deep green that should have been cold and was not. A smile with warmth in it, and something underneath that Alara instinctively wanted to keep at a distance. You must be the messenger, the woman said. I am Lady Seraphine Vale. I hope your chambers are comfortable. They are, thank you, Alara said. Seraphine entered without invitation, moved to the window Alara had just closed, and looked out at the pack garden. You have created quite a stir. The wolves howling upon your arrival. I have been at this court for 2 years and never witnessed anything of the kind. She turned. The blood moon ceremony is in 4 days. Kaelin has decided you should attend as a representative of the Human Council. An unprecedented honor. This was the first Alara had heard of it. I see. At the doorway, Seraphine paused. Do be careful, Miss Voss. The blood moon ceremony has very old power. Old power responds to things that are present, whether or not those things understand what they are. She held Alara's gaze one beat past comfortable. Sleep well. She left, and Alara decided she liked Seraphine Vale the way she liked thunderstorms, from a window, with the glass firmly shut. She did not sleep well. She dreamed of wolves. Not the 30 at the perimeter, but one wolf, singular and enormous, with winter sky eyes and fur the color of a storm about to break. It was running through a forest she did not recognize with a desperate urgency that was not fear, but something equally consuming, and she was running beside it. Or she was the thing it was running toward. Or possibly both at once, because dreams operated on logic that waking minds could only approximate. She felt herself waking as the wolf turned to look at her, and she caught, in the final dissolving second, a glimpse of those winter sky eyes, and the recognition in them, absolute and devastating. And then the morning light hit the unfamiliar ceiling, and she was left with the residue of it, which was the feeling of being recognized, which she had felt on the path yesterday, and which she was apparently not going to stop thinking about. She dressed and went down to breakfast. The Duskmore pack ate together in a great hall on the ground floor. Approximately 200 wolves in their human forms, eating at long wooden tables in a room that smelled of food and warmth, and the communal energy of people who had shared space so long that their individual energies had blurred at the edges. She was shown to a smaller diplomatic table near the head of the room, and she sat and ate, and tried not to be visibly affected by the fact that approximately half the room had looked at her when she entered, and then turned to look at each other with expressions that carried the weight of something being confirmed. Kaylin was at the head table, talking to a gray-haired man who had the compact, dense quality of someone who had been physically powerful for decades. And he was not looking at her, and the fact that she noticed he was not looking at her was information about herself she set aside to examine later. Seraphine was also at the head table, on Kaylin's right, watching Alara with serene attention. Alara returned it with professional neutrality, and they held this exchange for 3 seconds before Seraphine smiled and turned to someone beside her. "You are the human messenger," said a voice, and she turned to find that the chair across from her at the small diplomatic table had been occupied by a young man who had the Duskmore coloring, dark hair, and the winter-pale complexion of people who lived mostly in forest shadow, but whose face was open and curious in a way that contrasted with the general guarded quality of the pack's collective expression. He looked perhaps 20, with the kind of energy that suggested he had not yet finished becoming whatever he was going to be, and his eyes were a clear amber that matched nothing and no one she had seen in the hall. "I am Finn. I am Kaylin's youngest brother, and therefore the least important person in this room, which means I can say things to you that no one else will say because I have nothing to lose from being honest." She almost smiled. "What things will you say to me?" "That what happened at the gate yesterday has not happened in living memory," he said, leaning his elbows on the table with the casual ease of someone who had never been required to maintain proper posture at meals. "That the elders are convening about it. That Kaylin did not sleep last night." He paused, watching her face with those amber eyes. "And that you smell like pack. I know that probably means nothing to you because you are human, and this is not your language. But you smell like pack, and you smell like old blood. Old in the way that the founding stories are old. And if I were you, I would want to know that." Alara set down her fork. "I am human," she said. "I have been human my whole life." "Yes," Finn said, with the patience of someone who was making a distinction she had not made herself yet. "You have been human your whole life. That is not necessarily the same as what you are. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." The first day passed in a series of formal meetings. She sat across a long council table from 7 wolves in their human forms, 6 men and 1 woman of varying ages, and she answered questions about the treaty terms with the memorized precision that was her professional talent, watching their faces and noting who leaned forward and who leaned back, and filing all of it. Kaylin ran the meetings with an efficiency she respected, asking sharp questions that went straight to structural concerns rather than circling them. And when she answered, he listened with his full attention in a way that was both gratifying and unnerving, because full attention from Kaylin Duskmore was not a neutral thing to be the object of. After the second meeting, as the council filed out and she gathered her notes, he approached her alone. This was the first time they had been genuinely alone, and she noticed it with the part of herself that had been noticing things about him since Tuesday morning. "You have an unusual background for a messenger," he said. Not an accusation. An observation offered for her response. "My father trained me," she said. "I grew up in diplomatic households. The information retention is practical rather than formally educated. You memorize the secondary documentation." He meant the 40-page addendum to the primary treaty. Verbatim, not verbatim, in structure and substance. There is a difference. Something shifted in his expression. "What is the clause in subsection 14 regarding the Western Trade Corridor?" she told him. "Exactly, without hesitation, including the subordinate clause that most people skipped, because it appeared minor and was not. He was quiet for a moment. "You grew up reading pack history," he said then. And it was not a question. And she blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because you know things about our culture that are not in the briefing materials your father's office would have prepared. The way you have been addressing the council members. The way you entered the Great Hall this morning. Small things. They are the right things, which means they came from reading that was broader than preparation for this specific assignment." She had not thought she had been that visible. She had to recalibrate her estimate of his. "Observational precision. My father has an extensive library. Pack history and culture was part of it. I have always read broadly." "Why?" The question surprised her. "Because the world is large and I am small in it, and reading reduces the size of the unknown." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she still did not have a name for. And then he said, very quietly, as though the words were something he had decided to release, rather than something that simply came out, "I will see. You at dinner, Miss Voss." He left, and she stood alone in the council room with her notes, and the warm, complicated aftermath of his attention, and the memory of what Finn had said at breakfast. "You smell like pack. You smell like old blood." She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, where the knot sound from yesterday had been, where the dream had left its residue, and she made herself breathe evenly and go back to work. Seraphine found her in the library that afternoon. The Duskmoor library was on the same floor as her chambers, accumulated over centuries. Books and scrolls and bound manuscripts in half a dozen historical bindings, crowded onto shelves that had been expanded so many times. The original wall was invisible beneath layers of added wood. She had found the pack history section 2 hours before she became aware of Seraphine's presence, which was longer than she would have preferred to spend being unaware of her. "You are studying our history," Seraphine said from the end of the row, turning a small white flower between 2 fingers, with the calculated carelessness that sharpened Alara's alertness to a fine edge. "That is one of the founding records. The lineage of the Duskmoor bloodline from the first Alpha. It is considered sacred. Most members of the court do not touch it without permission." She paused. "How did you reach it?" Alara looked at the book in her hands. She had not made a conscious decision to take it from the shelf. Her hand had simply reached for it, the way hands sometimes reached for the right book before the brain had identified it as what was needed. "The librarian did not restrict it," she said carefully. "No," Seraphine agreed. "He would not restrict it from a blood member of the founding line." The white flower stopped turning. "I have been patient, Miss Voss. I want you to understand that. I have been building towards something here for 2 years, and I am very close. And I am asking you, woman to woman, to take your documents and your mysterious bloodline and leave these lands before the blood moon ceremony." Alara held the founding lineage record in both hands and said, in the steadiest voice she possessed, "I was invited to attend the ceremony by the Alpha King himself. I am here under diplomatic protection. And I do not take direction from people who are not my diplomatic counterpart." Seraphine held her gaze for 1 beat longer than was comfortable. "You do not know what you are," she said. "And unlike the observations from Finn, this felt less like information and more like a weapon being considered. I do. And there are things I could do with that knowledge that would be very bad for you." She turned and walked out with the flower still in her fingers, and Alara stood among the history shelves with the founding lineage record and the understanding that Seraphine Vielle knew something about her that she did not yet know about herself. She opened the founding lineage record that night in her chambers with the lamp turned high and the window cracked to let in cold air and the distant sounds of the forest. She turned pages carefully, reading the genealogical entries in the old script she had taught herself years ago in her father's library, tracing the Duskmoor bloodline from the first Alpha, who had established the territory 400 years ago. The lineage branched and merged in the complex patterns of a large founding family, and she traced the main line with her finger until, somewhere near the middle of the book, she found a notation that made her stop. "Lyra Duskmoor," the notation read, "3rd daughter of the 4th Alpha. marked by the moon, bonded but unclaimed. Departed the Packlands in the year of the bone moon, and was lost to the great forgetting. Lost to the great forgetting. She had seen the phrase in Pack histories, a term for the deliberate erasure from records, reserved for significant shame or significant secrecy. Someone had made Lyra Duskmore disappear. Alara sat with the book in her lap and thought about her own family history, which her father had always characterized as ancient and uninteresting. She thought about the word unclaimed. She thought about marked by the moon. She thought about Finn saying, "You smell like old blood," and Seraphine saying, "I do." And there are things I could do with that knowledge. She closed the founding lineage record and held it against her chest and sat very still. In the morning, she went to find Finn. She found him in the pack training grounds behind the main hall, engaged in what appeared to be a sparring session with 3 other young wolves that he was losing with considerable enthusiasm and no apparent distress. He saw her standing at the edge of the grounds and said something to his sparring partners that made 2 of them grin and one of them glance at her with the same weighted recognition she'd been seeing in wolf eyes since her arrival. And then he jogged over to her and was not even very winded, which she supposed made sense given what he was. "Lyra Duskmore," she said, without preamble, because she did not have patience this morning for the gradual approach. "Third daughter of the 4th Alpha. What happened to her?" Finn went very still. It was remarkable how completely still he could go when the moment called for it. All that openness and energy compressing into something quiet and watchful that reminded her of the other thing he was, underneath the 20-year-old. Casualness. "Where did you read that name?" "The founding lineage record, in the library." "The library let you take the founding lineage record?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long time with those amber eyes, and then he said, "Come with me," and turned and walked without looking back to check if she was following, which she was, because she was not going to stop now. He took her to the east wing of the main hall, which was older than the rest of the building, the original structure. She understood, around which the rest had been built over centuries. And he stopped at a door that was bound in iron and had no visible lock. He put his palm flat against the wood and held it there for approximately 5 seconds, and then the door swung open, and she followed him into a room that smelled of old paper and something else. Something that caught in the back of her throat like recognition. "This is the sealed archive," he said. "It requires pack blood to open. The fact that you can stand. In this room without the door expelling you is information." He went to a cabinet along the far wall and opened it, and produced a flat wooden box, which he brought to the reading table in the center of the room and set before her without opening. Lyra Duskmore left the Packlands 150 years ago. The official record says she departed voluntarily. The sealed archive says she was sent away. Alara sat down at the reading table. By whom? By the 4th Alpha, her own father, on the instruction of the council, because she was bonded to someone she was not supposed to be bonded to, and the council had arranged a different political match, and her bond was an inconvenience. He paused. Her mate bond was with a human man, from a diplomatic family. The council considered it a corruption of the bloodline. They erased her from the records and sent her into the human territories, and told her family she had died. Alara looked at the flat wooden box. Her hands were very steady. She was proud of how steady they were. "A diplomatic family," she said. "A diplomatic family named Voss," Finn said quietly. "She married him. She had children. She hid what she was because the pack had told her that if she revealed it, she would be returned and her children would be taken. She kept the secret. Her children kept the secret. Her grandchildren kept the secret. And then her great-great-granddaughter was born with the dormant bloodline of the Duskmore founding line running through her veins, and 150 years after Lyra was erased from the records, the pack's collective instinct recognized her, and every wolf at the outer perimeter howled. The silence in the sealed archive was total. Outside, distantly, she could hear the forest breathing. "Open the box," Finn said. She opened the box. Inside it was a letter in a handwriting she did not recognize, on paper that had gone brown at the edges with age, and a small pendant on a fine chain, a circle of what appeared to be pale stone through which a vein of darker material ran in the specific pattern she had seen at the top of the founding lineage record. She lifted the pendant, and it sat in her palm, and the stone was warm, which should not have been possible given how long it had been in the box in the cold archive, and at the moment she closed her fingers around it, something happened in her chest that was not the knot sound from the gate, was not the dream, was not the residue of attention or the echo of howling. It was something else entirely, something that felt like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time, and on the other side of the door was not darkness, but light. Old light. Old in the specific way that Finn had said her blood was old. Old in the way the founding stories were old. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. She sat in the sealed archive with the pendant in her closed fist and the old light, moving through her like weather, and she understood with the clear and total comprehension that sometimes arrived at the end of a long process of not understanding, that the world she had always occupied, the world in which she was unremarkable and efficiently invisible and of moderate value as a messenger, was not the true dimensions of the world. The true dimensions of the world were larger and older, and running through her blood in a pattern that had been waiting for 150 years to be read correctly. "What does this mean?" she asked, and her voice was steady, which she chose to interpret as a kind of bravery. "It means," Finn said, "that you are not a human diplomatic messenger who happens to be visiting the Duskmoor Pack. You are the blood of the founding line returning to the Packlands for the first time in a century and a half. It means the wolves howled, because they knew you before you knew yourself. It means the founding lineage record came to your hand. Because it belongs to your hand." He paused. "And it means that Kalen has been feeling the mate bond pull since the moment you walked through that gate, and he does not understand why. And it is making him absolutely miserable, which, I will be honest with you, is the most entertaining thing that has happened in this court in years." She pressed the pendant against her sternum and felt the old light pulse warmly against her skin and said, "He does not know. He knows something. He does not. Know what? The bond does not give you a name. It gives you a direction." Finn sat on the edge of the reading table with his arms crossed, and his amber eyes serious in a way they had not been at the breakfast table. "Ilara, the blood moon ceremony is in 2 days. It is the most powerful ritual the pack observes. The old power is at its strongest during that ceremony, and if you attend it as a founding bloodline member, even a dormant one, the power will recognize you. It will respond to you. It cannot not. And when it does, everything in that ceremony will change, and there will be no going back to being the human diplomatic messenger." She thought about the 3 days of her assignment. She thought about the treaty documents and the 40-page addendum and the subsection 14 clause about the Western Trade Corridor. She thought about the sealed archive door that had opened for her without a key, and the founding lineage record that had come to her hand, and the pendant that was warm in her fist as though it had been waiting at body temperature for a century and a half. She thought about Seraphine saying, "I do," and there are things I could do with that knowledge. She thought about being unremarkable for 24 years, and the specific loneliness of that. She thought about what Finn had said at breakfast, in the easy, honest way of someone with nothing to lose from honesty. You have been human your whole life. That is not necessarily the same as what you are. Tell me. About the blood moon ceremony, she said. Everything, he told her. It took an hour, and by the end of it she had more questions than she had started with. But they were better questions, more precisely calibrated to the specific situation, and she was grateful for that. The ceremony was the oldest ritual in the pack calendar, older than the main hall, older than the title of Alpha King, predating even the founding of the territory, and rooted in the relationship between the pack and the moon as a power source and a witness. It occurred once a year, on the night of the full moon closest to the winter solstice, and its function was simultaneously practical and sacred. It reaffirmed the pack bonds, strengthened the collective connection to the territory, and provided a space for recognitions of all kinds: matings, promotions in pack hierarchy, acknowledgments of bloodline. The Alpha King stood at the center of the ceremony and served as the channel through which the moon's power moved into the pack, which was the reason the selection of a mate for the Alpha King was treated as a matter of enormous communal importance rather than personal preference, because whoever stood beside him at the center became part of that channel. Seraphine had been positioning herself to stand at that center for 2 years. The council had been preparing for it. The announcement was expected at this blood moon, 4 generations of political maneuvering converging in a single night. Alara turned the D pendant between her fingers and thought about Seraphine's expression when she had said, "Leave these lands before the blood moon ceremony," and understood that the warning had not been cruelty. It had been self-preservation. Seraphine knew what Alara was. Seraphine had known before Alara did, and Seraphine understood what would happen if the founding bloodline stood at the center of a blood moon ceremony, because the ceremony itself would make the choice, and political maneuvering was not a thing. The moon took into account. She went to find Kalen. She did not plan what she was going to say. She found him in the pack garden below her window, standing on the stone path between the old trees, with his hands behind his back, and an expression she had not seen before. Something that was not the controlled management she had catalogued over 2 days, but was instead, nakedly, a kind of searching. She stepped onto the path, and he heard her and turned, and she felt the pendant warm against her. Breastbone and the old light in her blood turning toward him, the way a plant turned toward the sun. Instinctive and completely outside the territory of decisions. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I know," he said. "I do not know the specific content," he continued, his voice stripped of some of its usual control. "But I know it is something I have been trying to understand since you walked through the gate. I have not slept properly in 2 nights. My wolf will not stop orienting toward wherever you are in this building, which I would find deeply inconvenient if I were capable of being sufficiently irritated to feel inconvenienced." He paused. "Tell me." She told him. All of it, from the library and Seraphine's confrontation, to the sealed archive and the box and the pendant. She told him without apology and without performance, and he listened in complete stillness, with the pack garden breathing around them in the cold afternoon air. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she began constructing the versions of his response she was prepared for. Disbelief, political concern, the masculine embarrassment of a man who realized his instincts had been operating more clearly than his intellect. He gave her none of these. "Show me the pendant," he said. She held it forward and he touched it, one fingertip against the pale stone, and inhaled sharply and pulled his hand back. Not burned. The opposite of burned. She watched his face and saw the expression she had. Glimpsed in the receiving room on Tuesday and had not had a name for, and now she had one because she felt the echo of it in her own chest at the same moment. Recognition. Not the intellectual kind. The older recognition of one thing that has been searching for another thing for a very long time, finally finding it. "The council will not accept this without proof," he said, his voice rough. "Seraphine has 2 years of preparation and the full council majority, and I have a wolf that has not. Stopped howling internally since Tuesday morning and a founding bloodline pendant that just burned through my finger without burning me. It felt," he said, more carefully, "like recognizing a sound you have heard your whole life and suddenly understanding what it means. The bond has been pulling since you walked through the gate. I have been pretending it was something else. I am a very good pretender." The last sentence contained its own kind of honesty. "I do not know what to do with this." "Neither do I," she said. "But the blood moon ceremony is in 2 days, and Seraphine knows what I am, which means she is going to do something before then." He looked at her with the control back, not the management as lid kind, but the better kind, the kind that was focus. She will try to discredit you or remove you from the lands. She cannot do either without breaking diplomatic law or using the one piece of information she has that you do not yet have. The reason Lyra Duskmore was truly sent away, he said. The sealed archive has what she knows, but you have not yet read. The letter in the box. He held her gaze. I think you need to read it before tonight. She went back to the sealed archive. The door opened for her as it had for Finn, responding to the blood of the founding line in her veins in a way that still felt impossible, and was beginning to feel, beneath the impossibility, like something that had been waiting to feel natural for a very long time. She took the letter from the box and carried it to the reading table and sat down with the lamp and the old script and the patience that was her best quality. And she read it carefully, twice, making sure she had the old script right before she allowed herself to understand what it said. The letter was from Lyra Duskmore to her children, written in the human territories, dated approximately 3 years after her departure from the Packlands. It was practical in structure, the way letters written by someone who is managing grief through practicality tended to be practical, and in its practicality it was devastating. She wrote about her children's heritage. She wrote about what they carried in their blood. She wrote about the dormant wolf that would be in each of them and in their children's children, recessive but present, sleeping but alive. And then she wrote about the reason the council had truly forced her departure, which was not the human mate bond alone, which was, the council had admitted to her, father in the meeting she had overheard, something that the pack history could eventually absorb if managed correctly. The true reason was what she was, not who she was bonded to. What she was. Lyra Duskmore had been born with the full power of the founding line, which had not expressed itself in a Duskmore blood member in 4 generations, and which expressed itself not only as the standard alpha abilities, but as the moon-speaking gift. The ability to channel the moon's power directly at will, rather than only during ceremonies. The council had been afraid of it. A 4th alpha's daughter with moon-speaking ability and a bond to a human was a combination of factors they did not know how to control, and what could not be controlled was, in their calculation, best removed. The moon-speaking gift was hereditary, dormant in subsequent generations due to the dilution of the bloodline, but hereditary. And if the founding bloodline were to return to the Packlands and be recognized, and if that recognition were to occur during the most power-dense night of the Pack calendar, the moon-speaking gift might wake up. Not might. Would. The ceremony would wake it up the way sunlight woke a seed, not because anyone chose for it to happen, but because it was the nature of the thing to respond to its proper conditions. Seraphine knew this. Seraphine had clearly done the research that the council had either not done or had done and chosen to minimize. And Seraphine understood that a returning, founding line member with dormant moon-speaking ability at a blood moon ceremony was not a diplomatic inconvenience. She was a transformation of every power dynamic in the pack, including, and especially, the ones that Seraphine had spent 2 years constructing her position within. Elara sat with the letter and thought about transformation. She had spent 24 years being efficiently invisible, and she had made something that looked enough like peace with that to get her through the mornings. But she had always known that the peace was a performance. She had always known she was waiting for something and had not known what. And now she was sitting in a sealed archive her blood had opened, holding a letter from an ancestor erased from history, with a pendant warm against her skin and an old light in her blood that had been sleeping for a century and a half and was inexorably waking up. She put the letter back in the box with great care, stood, and straightened her coat, which was still the practical dark blue, still somewhat worse for travel, and had nothing to do with the magnitude of what was happening and was, she decided, the right thing to wear anyway, because she was still herself. She was still Elara Voss, and she was simply becoming a larger version of a thing she had always been. She walked out of the sealed archive and went to find Kalen. She told him about the letter, and he listened, and when she finished he said, "The council will convene tomorrow. Morning. Seraphine will have made her move before then. We have tonight. We have tonight, she agreed. Tell me what you need. It was such a simple question. She had spent her whole life being asked what she could provide, what she could carry, what she could deliver. She had not been asked what she needed very often, and the simplicity of it hit her in a way she had not expected. In the old light place in her chest, the place where the pendant rested. I need to read everything you have. About moon speaking, she said. I need to understand what is going to happen to me at that ceremony before it happens. And I need to know that you understand what it means. That it is not just the bond, not just the bloodline, but that you see me specifically, not what I represent to the pack or what I can do for the ceremony. She held his gaze. I have been invisible my whole life because I was useful, not because anyone looked. I cannot do this if I am doing it for utility. He crossed the space between them, which was not large, and he stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and the specific quality of his attention that she had been cataloging since Tuesday. He reached out and touched the pendant at her throat, properly this time, his fingers curling around the pale stone, and the warmth of it passed between them like a completed circuit. Old light meeting, old recognition. And she felt his wolf in that contact the way you felt weather, everywhere at once. I see you, he said. I saw you in the receiving room on Tuesday morning, and I spent 2 days pretending I had not, because seeing you was inconvenient, and seeing you meant understanding something I had not been prepared to understand. He released the pendant, gently. I see you, Alara. Not the bloodline, not the ceremony. You, specifically, who memorized the subsection 14 clause, and reached for the founding lineage record, and walked into a sealed archive like you had been walking in and out of it for years. She breathed. The old light in her blood settled into something steadier, something that felt less like waking up and more like being awake. Show me the moon-speaking records, she said. They spent the night in the library. Not the way she might have spent a night with a man she was beginning to understand was her mate in any other circumstances, but in the way that felt, she decided, like the right way for them specifically, sitting across a table in the library with the high lamp between them and the old record spread out, and him reading aloud the passages in the oldest script that her self-taught understanding of the historical language did not quite reach. His voice low and serious in the quiet of the library, while the rest of the hall slept. She learned about moon speaking. It was not dramatic, in the descriptions. It was not the operatic ability she might have imagined. It was closer to what Finn had said about her scent, closer to what the founding lineage. Records genealogical entries described as the gift's essence, which was the ability to hear what the moon was already saying and give it voice. Not to command, not to force, to translate and to channel, and to speak on behalf of something that existed in a frequency most beings could not access. She turned that over in her mind carefully, the distinction between power as dominance and power as translation, and something about it felt true, in the same way the sealed archive door had felt true. Not surprising, but like information fitting correctly into a space that had been empty. Somewhere around 3 a.m, with the lamp turned low and both of them leaned over the same document with their heads close together, he said quietly, I am going to make a declaration before the council tomorrow. What declaration? That the founding bloodline has returned to Duskmore territory, that the sealed archive has been opened by bloodright, that the blood moon ceremony will proceed. Under the recognition of an ancestral bloodline member. He paused. It will dissolve the arrangement with Seraphine. The council will not accept it quietly. You will have political conflict for months. I will have political conflict for months regardless. The question is whether I navigate it alone or with someone whose blood opened the sealed archive and who memorized my 40-page trade addendum and who, he said, with the faint quality in his voice that was not quite humor and was the closest he came to it, dreamed of running with my wolf 2 nights ago. She looked at him. You dreamed that too? Yes. Your wolf was running toward something. Yes. Was it me? He held her gaze across the low lamp. It was always you, he said. My wolf knew before I did, which is apparently how this works, and which I am reconciling with my dignity as best I can." She almost laughed. It was the first time she had come close to laughing since Tuesday, and it felt like something releasing in her chest alongside the old light. "I do not need your dignity to be fully intact," she said. "I need you to mean what you say." "I mean everything I say," he said. "I say very few things." She believed him. She had been watching him for 2 days, and he was the most economical speaker she had encountered in 24 years of diplomatic households, and every word she had heard him use had been precisely selected, and nothing she had heard him say had been anything other than exactly what he meant. She believed him. They stayed in the library until the lamp ran out of oil, and the cold gray of pre-dawn came through the windows, and then she went to her chambers, and he went to his, and they were not there yet. They were 2 people at the beginning of something enormous that was also ancient, and also had been waiting for a century and a half for the conditions to be right, and the enormity of it required that they come to it properly, not rushed, not in the middle of the night in a library, not before the ceremony that was going to change everything had had its chance to change everything. In the morning, Seraphine made her move. Alara had expected it, and still was not entirely prepared for its specific form, because Seraphine was more sophisticated than the expected approaches, and had done more preparation than Alara had fully credited. She came to the council chamber before Kalen's planned declaration, and she came with documents, and the documents were a set of correspondence between Alara's father and a rival trading consortium. Correspondence that alleged that the Voss diplomatic mission was not a genuine peace treaty effort, but an intelligence-gathering operation designed to map Duskmore territory and pack hierarchy for human interests that were hostile to pack sovereignty. The documents were, as Alara looked at them across the council table, while Seraphine presented them with her elegant measured voice and her architectural hair and her expression of genuine regret, forgeries. She knew they were forgeries because she knew her father's handwriting, and these letters used a slightly different formation of the lowercase letter E that her father had never used in his life, and because she knew the treaty terms themselves were genuine because she had watched them be negotiated across 6 months of her own observation and partial participation. But they were good forgeries. They were the kind of forgeries that required resources and time and contacts in the Human Council's administrative offices, which meant they had been prepared well in advance, which meant Seraphine had known for longer than 2 days what Alara was, or had suspected it for longer, had perhaps been watching the Voss family for reasons connected to information the Duskmore Council kept in records she had access to. Alara stood at the council table and looked at the forgeries, and felt the cold, clear anger of someone who had been targeted not personally, but politically, targeted as a symbol of a threat rather than as herself, which was a specific kind of dismissal that she was intimately familiar with, and which she was, she decided, done tolerating. "These are forgeries," she said, into the council chamber's surprised silence. "I can demonstrate it. The handwriting has inconsistencies in 14 places that I can identify for you now. I would also point out that the correspondence references a consortium that did not exist under the name used in these documents until 4 months after the dates on the letters, which you can verify through the Human Council's public trade registry, and that if this council would like to contact my father directly through the diplomatic communication network, I can provide the authentication codes that will establish identity and allow you to ask him these questions in a format that cannot be forged." The council chamber was very quiet. Kalen, at the head of the table, was looking at her with the expression she now had a name for, and alongside the recognition in it was something new, something that looked like an alpha watching something that belonged to his pack demonstrate exactly why it belonged there. "I would also," she said, "like to submit to this council the founding lineage record, which came to my hand unrestricted in the library, and the letter from Lyra Duskmore currently in the sealed archive, which I accessed by blood right, and this." She lifted the pendant from beneath her collar and held it so the council could see the pale stone and the dark vein and the specific pattern that matched the symbol at the head of the founding genealogy. The The council may wish to consult the historical records regarding the items that were placed in the sealed archive for safekeeping approximately 150 years ago and the conditions under which they were to be returned to the founding bloodline. The gray-haired man on Kaylin's left, who she had identified over 2 days of meetings as the senior council member and the most politically experienced person in the room, looked at the pendant, and at her, and back at the pendant, and she watched his expression move through several stages of calculation that ended somewhere that looked like a man restructuring his understanding of a situation. He looked at Seraphine. Seraphine was very still, with the beautiful controlled composure of someone who had prepared for multiple outcomes and was currently determining which of her preparations still applied. "Alpha King," the senior council member said, turning to Kaylin with the formal register of official council speech. "I believe we have a significant procedural matter to address before any other business this morning." "We do," Kaylin said. "I will make my declaration now." He made it in the formal language of pack law, which she had read enough about to follow with reasonable accuracy, the declaration of the return of founding bloodline to Duskmore. Territory, the evidence of the sealed archive, and the library recognition, and the pendant, the annulment of previous ceremonial arrangements in light of the changed circumstances. He was economical about it, as he was economical about everything. But the economy of it did not diminish the weight. The room felt the weight. Seraphine sat with her beautiful, composed face, and absorbed the weight with a stillness that Alara could only respect, even now. Because whatever Seraphine was, and whatever she had done, she was also someone who had built something carefully, and was watching it come apart with her spine straight and her hands folded on the table, and that required a kind of fortitude that was not nothing. After the meeting, after the council had dispersed into the urgent consultations that were going to occupy the next 24 hours, as everyone recalibrated their positions, Seraphine stopped Alara in the corridor outside the council chamber. They were alone. Seraphine looked at her. With those precisely symmetrical features completely neutral for the first time since they had met, stripped of the performance of warmth and the performance of threat, and just present as they were. "You are not what I expected," Seraphine said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who could be frightened. Someone who would not understand the documents in the founding record, or who would understand them and not know how to use them. Someone who arrived as a piece on the board rather than a player." She paused. "I have been playing this game for 2 years, and I am very good at it." "I know," Alara said. "You are exceptionally good at it." Something in Seraphine's expression shifted. A small movement, quickly controlled. "The forgeries were wrong. I want you to understand that I understand that. I was protecting something I had worked very hard for, and I used methods I am not proud of." "I know that too," Alara said. She looked at this woman who had spent 2 years building something that one returning bloodline had dismantled in 4 days, and she thought about what it meant to have power and have it taken, and she thought about the difference between people who were her enemies, because they were genuinely opposed to her, and people who were her enemies because she had arrived at an inconvenient time. "What do you want, Seraphine?" "Not the Alpha Queen position. What do you actually want?" The silence that followed was the most genuine moment they had shared. Seraphine looked at her for a long time, and then she said, "I want to matter. I want what I do to have consequence. I am not interested in standing beside someone for the title. I want my own power." "Then do not stand beside someone," Alara said. "Build your own thing." It was not a solution. It was not a neat resolution to 2 years of complicated positioning and 1 attempted forgery. And she was not naive enough to think that a corridor conversation had turned Seraphine into an ally. But something moved in. Seraphine's expression that was not the calculating smile or the performed warmth. Something that looked, briefly, like the beginning of a different consideration. She inclined her head, very slightly, and moved past Alara down the corridor with the unhurried grace that was simply how she moved, and Alara watched her go and thought that the world was full of people who were impressive in the wrong direction, and that it was a waste, and that she hoped Seraphine eventually found the right direction. The blood moon rose that night. She had not understood, from the descriptions Finn had given her, or from the records she had read, the physical reality of the ceremony. Understanding it intellectually had not prepared her for standing in the great open ceremony ground at the moment. The full moon cleared the tree line, and feeling the light hit her skin, and knowing with the immediacy of a physical sensation what moon-speaking actually meant. It was not metaphorical. It was a frequency, a register of information in the moonlight itself. Information her blood had been capable of receiving for a century and a half, dormant until the proximity of the ceremony and the pendant and the sealed archive had been gradually waking it, and which the direct blood moonlight woke completely between one breath and the next. She stopped walking and put her hand over her sternum, and felt the old light blaze up inside her like a lamp turned fully on after years at its lowest setting. The pack felt it. The air changed the way it had changed at the gate on Tuesday morning. 200 wolves orienting toward the same point. Toward her. Kaelin was at the center of the ceremony ground, and he turned when the air changed, and across the moonlit space their eyes met, and the bond that had been pulling since Tuesday with the pull of gravity, constant and inescapable and pretended away, snapped into full clarity like a cord finally resolved. The moon had other plans for her role in the ceremony. She felt the power moving through the ground the way you felt weather, channeling through the Alpha King at the center, and at the point where it would normally distribute through the pack bonds, it paused. It found her. It found the founding blood in her veins, and the moon-speaking gift blazing awake in her chest, and said, in the frequency she had spent 24 years unable to hear, "Here. Here is where the channel is. Here is where it has always been." She walked to the center without making a conscious decision. Kaelin watched her come and did not stop her, and she moved through the ceremony ground while 200 wolves and 7 council members and 1 composed former candidate observed in total silence. And she stopped beside him and felt the moon's power find its proper channel through both of them, through the bond and the blood they carried, his by birthright and hers by the long journey of a dormant line returning to its source. The old light blazed up to meet it, and the moon-speaking gift that had been sleeping for 150 years said, in a frequency the entire pack could feel, "I am here. I have come home." The ceremony ground erupted in howling, all 200 of them, the recognition howl that the elder wolves described from generations past, not heard in living memory until Tuesday morning on a pale gravel path, now filling the ceremony ground and rising above the tree line like a declaration. She stood at the center with the moon's power moving. Through her like a river finding its course, aware of Kaelin beside her, the bond between them fully present for the first time in its true dimensions, larger and older and more certain than anything she had vocabulary for. She was aware of the pack and the council and Seraphine at the outer edge with her spine straight, and she was aware of the pendant and Lyra Duskmore who had been erased from the records, and whose great-great-granddaughter had carried the dormant bloodline across a century, and a half until it came back to the lands it belonged to. She stood at the center of it, and she was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been waiting for the correct conditions. Kaelin's hand found hers, and she felt it as something completed, a circuit waiting for its final connection. And she turned to look at him, and his winter sky eyes in the blood moon light were the eyes from the dream. The wolf running through the forest she now recognized as this forest, this territory that her blood had been pointing toward for 24 years. He held her hand in full sight of the pack and said nothing, because he was an economical speaker, and the gesture was the word. The senior council member completed the ceremony in the changed configuration, and when the final words were spoken, the power moved through the ceremony ground one final time, settling, becoming part of the territory's memory. She felt it through her feet, as though the ground itself was acknowledging something corrected. She was not asked to leave. The treaty was not abandoned. In the 3 days following the blood moon, the council reviewed the founding lineage documentation, authenticated the letter from the sealed archive, consulted with 3 elder wolves whose collective memory was the living library of the pack, and formally recognized the return of the founding bloodline. The treaty terms were extended to include a new clause, her clause, that she drafted herself, and that addressed the historical relationship between the Duskmore pack and the human territories, with the specificity of someone who understood both sides from the inside. Her father was informed. The conversation was long and difficult, and at the end of it he said, in the voice of someone finally setting down something heavy, "Your grandmother knew. I think your mother knew. I did not know how to give you this, so I gave you the library instead." He paused. "Did it help?" "Yes," she said. "It helped more than you know." Seraphine Vale left the Duskmore court 3 weeks after the blood moon, not in disgrace, but in the way that someone leaves when they have recalibrated their destination, with purpose and luggage and the expression of a person who has decided the current location is simply not the right one. She sent Alara a brief note before departing that ended, in handwriting less architectural than expected. "I think you may have been right about building one's own thing. I intend to try." Alara kept the note. Kaelin asked her to stay. He asked in the library, at the same table where they had spent the night in the moon-speaking records, with the lamp between them and no urgency in the air, because urgency had resolved itself in the ceremony ground, and what remained was the quieter and more permanent thing that came after. He asked without theatrics. He asked her because she was his mate, and because she was the founding blood, and because the pack needed what she was, all of, which he said plainly, and then he said, "And because when you are in this building, I know where north is, and when you are not, I am aware that I do not know, and I prefer knowing." She thought about the treaty documents and her father's library, and the pale gravel path, and the wolves howling, and the sealed archive door, and the dream of running toward a forest she had not known she was running toward. She thought about 24 years of arriving and delivering and leaving, and not lingering in. Memory. "I will need permanent access to the sealed archive," she said. "The moon-speaking research has gaps that need addressing, and I will continue the treaty work. I am better equipped for it than anyone currently on your diplomatic staff." She paused. "And I want Finn to stop deliberately losing his sparring matches to protect the morale of people slower than him. It is bad for his development." Kaelin looked at her with the expression she had a name for now, and the warmth alongside it that he did not perform. "I will pass that along." "Then yes," she said. "I will stay." She stayed. The winter solstice came, and the pack gathered in the great hall, and the elder wolves told the founding stories at the solstice fire. The ones the pups were supposed to be almost asleep for, but rarely were. This year, the stories included a new one, the oldest story made new again, about the bloodline that was lost and came back, about the daughter of the 4th Alpha who had been erased from the records and whose great-great-granddaughter had walked down a pale gravel path one autumn morning and been recognized before she recognized herself. The pups listened with wide eyes, and Alara sat by the fire, and Kaelin sat beside her, and his wolf was settled in the way it had not been for 11 years of managing things, and the old light in her blood was warm and steady and awake, and outside, the Duskmore territory breathed in the winter dark, all its old trees and its old power, and it knew what it contained. The wolves did not howl that night. They did not need to. What had been called had come. What had been lost had returned. The recognition was complete. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?